Hello friends and history buffs, how are you? I hope everything is well. Today we are stepping into the most eerie and hidden story of creation, which I have shuddered over the most in my life, the pitch-black shadow of Lilith. If this dark mythology journey interests you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to join our family. Also, thinking of that eerie silence of the night, I wondered, what is your favorite music genre? Let's meet in the comments. In the quiet corners of ancient libraries where dust settles on forgotten texts, whispers of a woman echo through time. Her name carries the weight of rebellion. Lilith, the first companion, the one who dared to say no. Long before Eve walked in the Garden of Eden, another woman breathed the same sacred air. She moved through paradise with wild hair and untamed eyes. Her story lives in shadows, hidden between the lines of scripture, buried beneath centuries of silence. Why was she erased? The question haunts scholars who trace her footsteps through crumbling manuscripts. Religious authorities speak in hushed tones about the texts that mention her. Some call these writings heretical. Others whisper that they hold dangerous truths. The official story tells us Adam was alone until God fashioned Eve from his rib. Yet older stories breathe different words. They speak of a first woman made from the same earth as Adam who refused to bow. These tales emerge from the Babylonian Talmud, from mystical Jewish texts, from the folklore of countless generations. Picture Eden in those earliest days. The garden stretched endlessly, filled with creatures that knew no fear. Rivers flowed in 4 directions, carrying life to every corner of this green sanctuary. Adam walked among the animals, naming them one by one. But something remained incomplete in this perfect world. God saw that man should not dwell alone. The Creator's hands reached into the same earth that had formed Adam. From that clay came forth a woman of equal measure. She stood as tall as Adam, breathed the same divine breath, carried the same spark of creation in her eyes. Ah, this was Lilith. Her name rolls off the tongue like wind through leaves. In ancient Sumerian, her sisters were called Leolichu, night spirits who danced in storms. The Babylonians knew her as a creature of wild places, untamable and fierce. When Jewish scholars encountered these stories during their exile, they wove them into their own understanding of creation. Lilith emerged as something more than myth. She became a symbol of the untamed feminine, the aspect of creation that refused to be controlled. Her presence in Eden carried the essence of primordial power, the force that exists before rules and hierarchies take hold. The garden itself seemed different with Lilith in it. Where Eve would later tend to flowers with gentle care, Lilith ran with wolves. Where Eve would seek Adam's guidance, Lilith explored the furthest reaches of paradise alone. She spoke with angels and demons alike, unafraid of either light or shadow. Ancient texts describe her beauty as both terrible and wonderful. Her hair moved like living flames. Her voice could calm storms or summon them. She possessed wisdom that came not from submission, but from direct communion with the divine forces that shaped the world. Yet something stirred uneasily in this first paradise. Adam, accustomed to naming and ordering creation, found himself beside an equal who would not be named or ordered. Lilith's independence created ripples in the perfect harmony God had established. These ripples would grow into waves that would ultimately wash her from official memory. The tension between them began subtly. Adam would suggest they rest in one spot, and Lilith would wander to another. He would speak of their purpose in Eden, and she would question why purposes needed to be defined at all. Their differences, at first endearing, began to create distance between them. Religious scholars who study these hidden texts often pause at this point in the story. They recognize something profound happening in these early moments. The narrative reveals not just the tale of two people, but the eternal struggle between order and chaos, between hierarchy and equality, between the desire to control and the need to be free. Lilith's presence in Eden challenges everything we think we know about the beginning of human story. She stands as evidence that creation itself contained multiple possibilities, multiple ways of being human. Her existence suggests that the path taken by Adam and Eve was not the only path available. In medieval manuscripts, scribes sometimes included marginal notes about Lilith. These annotations, written in careful Hebrew letters, acknowledge her reality while warning against her influence. The writers seem torn between denying her existence and fearing her power. This tension reveals how deeply her story had embedded itself in Jewish consciousness. The mystery deepens when we realize how thoroughly she was removed from mainstream religious teaching. Someone made a deliberate choice to elevate Eve's story while suppressing Lilith. This decision shaped how generations would understand women, marriage, and the very nature of divine creation. Modern archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia that referenced female spirits matching Lilith's description. These discoveries suggest her story reaches back thousands of years before Jewish scribes wrote her into their mystical texts. She emerges from humanity's earliest attempts to understand the wild, untamable aspects of existence. As we prepare to follow Lilith's journey through history, one truth becomes clear. Her story refuses to stay buried. Despite centuries of suppression, despite official denial, her name continues to surface in literature, art, and folklore. She represents something in human experience that cannot be completely erased. The part of us that questions authority, that demands equality, that chooses freedom even when it comes with a price. The shadow she cast in Eden still falls across our modern world. Understanding her requires us to look beyond simple tales of good and evil, to explore the complex reality of what it means to be human, to be free, to be equal in the eyes of the divine. Her story begins in paradise, but it leads us into the wilderness where truth often hides. There, in the spaces between official histories, Lilith waits to tell her tale. The birth of Lilith. Long before Adam drew his first breath in Eden, ancient peoples gazed into storm clouds and saw feminine shapes dancing in the darkness. They whispered names that carried power. Leletu in Sumerian temples, Lamassu in Babylonian streets, Ardat Lili in sacred groves where priests made offerings to appease the night spirits. These weren't demons in the way later traditions would understand evil. They were forces of nature itself, wild, unpredictable, essential. The Mesopotamians recognized them as part of the cosmic order, spirits who brought both destruction and renewal. Lightning split the sky at their command. Winds obeyed their whispers. They ruled the liminal spaces where day met night. Thus, where order touched chaos, the Sumerian goddess Inanna descended into the underworld, and her journey echoed in later stories of Lilith's exile from paradise. Both figures embodied the divine feminine that refused to be contained or controlled. Both chose their own paths, accepting the consequences that came with independence. When Jewish people found themselves captives in Babylon, they encountered these ancient stories. Scholars sat in temple courtyards debating how to preserve their own traditions while living among foreign gods and different creation myths. The experience transformed their understanding of their own history. Babylonian influence seeped into Jewish thought like water into dry earth. The exile lasted 70 years, long enough for an entire generation to grow up surrounded by Mesopotamian culture. Children heard Sumerian lullabies alongside Hebrew prayers. Young scholars studied Babylonian astronomy while memorizing Torah verses. During this period of cultural mixing, Lilith began her transformation from ancient storm spirit to Jewish mystical figure. The process wasn't sudden or deliberate. Instead, it happened gradually as Jewish storytellers encountered the fierce independence of Mesopotamian night goddesses and recognized something familiar in their defiance. The earliest Jewish references to Lilith appear in texts written after the Babylonian exile. The prophet Isaiah mentions her in passing, describing desolate places where Lilith shall find for herself a resting place. This brief reference suggests her name was already known to Hebrew audiences, already carried connotations of wildness and abandonment. But the Isaiah reference treats her as one demon among many, not as the complex figure she would later become. The full flowering of her character required centuries of development. As Jewish mystics pondered the deeper meanings hidden within creation stories, medieval Jewish scholars faced a puzzle. Their creation accounts spoke of Adam being alone until God fashioned Eve. Yet other ancient sources suggested multiple attempts at creating woman, multiple companions for the first man. How could these seemingly contradictory stories be reconciled? The answer came through Midrash, the tradition of expanding biblical narratives to fill in missing details. Mystical writers began to suggest that perhaps there had been a first woman created before Eve whose story had been deliberately omitted from Scripture. This woman became identified with Lilith, the night spirit mentioned in Isaiah. The alphabet of Benna, written sometime between the 8th and 11th centuries, provided the most detailed account of this theory. In this text, Lilith appears as Adam's first wife, created simultaneously with him from the same earth. The story explains her absence from Genesis, while acknowledging her presence in Jewish folklore. This development reveals how Jewish culture processed trauma. The Babylonian exile had shattered their understanding of divine protection and chosen status. Traditional answers no longer satisfied deep questions about suffering and injustice. Lilith emerged as a figure who embodied the experience of abandonment, the reality of women who refused to accept subordinate roles. Her character drew from multiple sources beyond Mesopotamian mythology. The wild woman of Sumerian poetry merged with the independent goddess of Canaanite religion. Features from Egyptian magic blended with Persian dualism. Lilith became a repository for all the aspects of feminine power that mainstream Judaism struggled to accommodate. Ancient amulets discovered by archaeologists show how deeply Lilith had embedded herself in popular consciousness. These protective charms, worn by pregnant women and new mothers, specifically invoke protection against Lilith and her daughters. The widespread use of such amulets suggests belief in her power extended far beyond scholarly circles. The merger wasn't complete until medieval Kabbalistic texts fully developed her role in mystical cosmology. These works portrayed her as the dark mirror of the Shekinah, God's feminine presence. Where the Shekinah represented divine love and mercy, Lilith embodied divine wrath and justice. Both were necessary aspects of divine nature. This theological development transformed Lilith from a minor demon into a cosmic principle. She became the force that challenges, tests, and ultimately strengthens divine creation. Her rebellion in Eden wasn't simply disobedience. It was part of the cosmic drama that makes spiritual growth possible. Persian influences also shaped her evolution. Zoroastrian dualism, with its cosmic struggle between light and darkness, provided a framework for understanding Lilith's role as necessary opposition to divine order. She wasn't evil in the simple sense, but rather represented the shadow that makes light visible. Greek philosophy encountered through her Hellenistic Jewish writers contributed additional layers to her character. The concept of the eternal feminine, thema, that exists as counterpart to masculine consciousness, found expression in Lilith's refusal to be subsumed into Adam's identity. By the medieval period, Lilith, uniquely Jewish, while remaining connected to her ancient origins, she represented the path not taken, the choice for independence over security, the voice that questions divine authority even when such questioning leads to exile. Her birth from these multiple traditions reveals something profound about how cultures preserve dangerous knowledge. Official histories may suppress inconvenient truths, but folklore finds ways to keep them alive. Lilith survived because she answered questions that official stories left unasked. The complex process of her development also shows how exile can become creative force. The Babylonian captivity, traumatic as it was, exposed Jewish thinkers to ideas that enriched their understanding of divine nature. Lilith emerged from this cross-cultural fertilization as a figure uniquely equipped to challenge patriarchal assumptions while remaining rooted in Jewish spiritual tradition. Her mythological birth prepared her for the role she would play in Eden, not as Adam's helpmate, but as his equal and eventual opponent. Lilith, in the garden, morning light filtered through leaves that had never known autumn. As Lilith opened her eyes for the first time, the breath of God still warm in her lungs. She rose from the same earth that had formed Adam moments before. Her body moved with natural grace, unashamed and unafraid. She was woman, complete and whole, shaped by divine hands to be companion, not servant. Adam stood nearby, watching her emergence with wonder. Here at last was another like himself, someone who walked upright, who could speak and reason, who carried the divine spark behind intelligent eyes. Yet something in her gaze suggested depths he had not expected, currents of thought that flowed in directions he could not predict. Their first conversation began with simple observations. The flowers bloomed more vibrantly than yesterday. A family of deer grazed peacefully by the eastern river. The fruit trees offered endless variety of taste and texture. They spoke as equals, sharing their wonder at the paradise surrounding them. But differences emerged gradually, like shadows lengthening at day's end. Adam found comfort in naming things, in creating order and categories. Each creature needed its proper place, each plant its designated purpose. This gave him satisfaction, a sense of contributing to divine design. Lilith moved differently through Eden. She didn't seek to name or categorize, but simply to experience. When butterflies landed on her shoulders, she didn't identify their species, but marveled at their colors. When lions approached, she didn't establish dominance, but communed with their wild hearts. The tension first appeared during intimate moments. Adam, following what seemed natural to him, expected Lilith to lie beneath him during their physical union. This felt right to his understanding of their roles. He would shelter and protect. She would receive and nurture. The position reflected what he saw as proper order. Lilith questioned this assumption. Why should she always be beneath when they were created equal? Why should position in lovemaking reflect hierarchy rather than mutual pleasure? Her questions weren't rebellious, but genuinely curious. She sought to understand the reasoning behind practices Adam considered natural. Their discussions grew more heated as days passed. Adam pointed to the animals around them. Males typically dominated, females submitted. This seemed to be the pattern woven into creation itself. Following this order would bring harmony to their relationship and to Eden. But Lilith observed different patterns. She watched eagles soar in pairs, neither consistently above the other. She saw wolves hunt together, each contributing unique strengths. The natural world seemed more complex than Adam's interpretation suggested, filled with examples of cooperation rather than domination. Their philosophical differences extended beyond physical intimacy. Adam believed their purpose in Eden was to tend the garden according to divine instruction. They should cultivate what God had planted, maintain the boundaries God had established, preserve the order God had created. Lilith wondered whether their purpose might be broader. Perhaps they were meant to explore all possibilities within Eden, to push boundaries rather than maintain them, to participate in ongoing creation rather than simply preserving what already existed. Her vision included adventure, discovery, change. These contrasting worldviews created daily friction. Adam would wake with plans for organizing their activities, dividing responsibilities, establishing routines. Lilith would rise, eager to explore new territories, discover unknown plants, commune with creatures they hadn't yet encountered. The conflict reached its climax during a particularly beautiful sunset. They sat beside a stream, watching light dance on water, when Adam again suggested she should acknowledge his authority in their relationship. He spoke gently, believing this arrangement would bring peace. Lilith's response surprised him with its intensity. She had been created from the same earth, breathed the same divine breath, carried the same divine image. What gave him authority over her? She refused to submit simply because he was male, refused to pretend inequality existed where God had created equals. The argument that followed shook the very foundations of Eden. Angels paused in their celestial songs. Animals retreated to safe distances. The garden itself seemed to hold its breath as the first humans discovered the power of profound disagreement. In her passion, Lilith spoke the ineffable name of God, the sacred syllables that commanded all creation. This wasn't blasphemy, but desperate appeal to divine justice. She called upon the Creator to witness that she had been made equal, that submission was not part of her nature. The name resonated through Eden with power that made trees bow and rivers change course. Adam fell silent, recognizing that Lilith possessed knowledge and authority he had not suspected. She had accessed something beyond his understanding, connected with divine power in ways that challenged his assumptions about their relationship. But the speaking of the sacred name also triggered consequences neither had foreseen. Ancient Jewish texts suggest that certain divine words, once spoken in anger or desperation, cannot be taken back. They release forces that must find their natural conclusion. Lilith felt change beginning within her, a loosening of ties that bound her to Eden and to Adam. The sacred name had awakened something wild and independent in her nature, something that could not coexist with Adam's vision of ordered hierarchy. She understood that staying would mean endless conflict, eternal struggle against expectations she could never fulfill. The choice before her became clear. She could submit to Adam's vision of proper order and lose essential parts of herself, or she could honor her true nature and face whatever consequences came with independence. For Lilith, this wasn't really a choice at all. As night fell over Eden, she made her decision. The paradise that had seemed so perfect now felt constraining. The man who had seemed like ideal companion now appeared as potential jailer. The very beauty of Eden became a trap if it required her to deny her authentic self. Her departure wasn't dramatic or angry. She simply walked away as dawn approached, moving toward the eastern gate, where Eden met the wider world. Each step took her further from safety and security, closer to unknown dangers and uncertain future. Behind her, Adam woke to find himself alone again. The space where Lilith had slept remained empty, marked only by the lingering scent of wild roses and the memory of a woman who had chosen freedom over paradise. The garden continued its eternal spring, but something had changed forever. The first crack had appeared in Eden's perfection, the first hint that divine creation might contain possibilities its creator had not fully foreseen. The aftermath. Dawn broke over Eden to find Adam alone among the flowering trees. The space beside him where Lilith had slept remained empty, the grass still holding the impression of her body, but no longer warm with her presence. He called her name through the garden paths, his voice echoing off crystal streams and marble fountains, but only silence answered. Confusion clouded his thoughts as he searched through groves and meadows where they had walked together. Perhaps she wandered early to gather fruit from distant orchards. Perhaps she communed with angels at the garden's eastern boundary. Surely she would return when hunger drew her homeward. But afternoon shadows lengthened without sign of her return. Adam found himself experiencing something entirely new, the hollow ache of loneliness. During his time alone before Lilith's creation, he had felt incomplete, but hadn't understood what was missing. Now he knew exactly what was gone, and the knowledge made the emptiness unbearable. Evening came with its usual chorus of night birds and rustling leaves, but the sounds brought no comfort. Adam sat beside their favorite stream, watching water flow over smooth stones, waiting for footsteps that never came. The paradise around him remained beautiful, but beauty without companionship felt hollow. When full darkness settled over the garden, Adam lifted his voice in prayer. He spoke to the Creator who had formed them both from earth and breath, pouring out his confusion and pain. Why had Lilith left their perfect home? Why had she chosen the unknown wilderness over Eden's safety? Why had their disagreements driven her to such drastic action? The divine response came not in words, but in understanding that settled into Adam's consciousness like dew on morning grass. Lilith had been created equal, formed with the same divine spark that animated his own soul. Her departure wasn't rebellion against God, but assertion of the independence God had built into her nature. This revelation brought little comfort. If Lilith was meant to be free, why did her freedom leave him devastated? If equality was part of divine design, why couldn't they have found ways to honor both their autonomy and their partnership? The questions multiplied without answers. Adam's complaints to God grew more specific over the following days. He spoke of Lilith's refusal to accept proper order, her questioning of natural hierarchy, her disturbing willingness to invoke sacred names in moments of passion. Surely God could see that such behavior disrupted the harmony of Eden. Yet even as he voiced these complaints, Adam recognized their partial nature. Lilith had also brought wonder to his existence, her different perspective on creation, her wild joy in discovering new aspects of paradise, her fierce intelligence that challenged him to think beyond his assumptions. The garden felt diminished without her unique way of seeing. Weeks passed in this strange twilight existence. Adam tended the garden as before, but mechanical routine replaced joyful cooperation. He named new species when they appeared, but classification felt empty without Lilith's alternative interpretations. Food sustained him, but meals lacked flavor without conversation to accompany them. The animals sensed his distress. Deer approached more cautiously. Birds sang less frequently near his dwelling place. Even the lions, usually respectful of his authority, kept greater distance. Eden's ecology responded to the emotional void at its center. During this period of solitude, Adam began to understand aspects of himself that partnership with Lilith had obscured. He discovered how much his sense of purpose depended on having someone to lead and protect. Without that role, he felt adrift, uncertain of his place in divine plan. God observed Adam's struggle with compassion, tinged by cosmic necessity. The first human needed companionship, but Lilith's departure had taught valuable lessons about the complexities of relationship. The next attempt at creating a suitable partner would benefit from this hard-won wisdom. When God announced the intention to create another woman, Adam felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. Would this new companion also question his authority? Would she to possess the fierce independence that made harmony so difficult to achieve? His longing for partnership battled with fear of repeating past failures. The method of creation differed significantly this time. Instead of forming woman from separate earth, God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. From his own rib, from his own flesh and bone, the Creator fashioned his second companion. She would be part of him in ways Lilith never had been. Adam awakened to find Eve standing beside him, beautiful and gentle and somehow familiar. Her eyes held intelligence, but not the challenging intensity that had marked Lilith's gaze. She smiled with warmth that promised cooperation rather than confrontation. Here at last was the companion who would bring peace to Eden. Their first conversation flowed smoothly. Eve admired the garden's beauty and asked Adam to tell her about the various plants and animals. She listened attentively as he explained the order God had established, nodding approvingly at his descriptions of proper relationships between creatures. Her questions sought information rather than challenging assumptions. When they came together intimately, Eve naturally took the position beneath Adam without discussion or debate. She seemed to understand instinctively the roles that would bring harmony to their relationship. Her submission felt genuine rather than forced, born from her essential nature rather than imposed expectations. The contrast with Lilith couldn't have been sharper. Where Lilith had questioned everything, Eve accepted Adam's guidance. Where Lilith had insisted on equality, Eve acknowledged his leadership. Where Lilith had chosen exile over submission, Eve chose partnership over independence. Yet something in Adam's memory preserved appreciation for what Lilith had brought to his existence. Her challenges had forced him to examine his beliefs more deeply. Her questions had revealed complexities in creation he might never have noticed. Her presence had awakened parts of himself that remained dormant in the peaceful routine he shared with Eve. Sometimes in quiet moments, Adam wondered about Lilith's fate in the wilderness beyond Eden's gates. Did she find the freedom she had sought? Did she regret the paradise she had abandoned? Did she ever think of the love they had shared despite their fundamental differences? These thoughts came less frequently as time passed and his relationship with Eve deepened. The new harmony in Eden gradually healed the wounds Lilith's departure had created. The garden bloomed more abundantly. Animals approached without fear. Divine presence felt closer and more constant. But seeds of future trouble had been planted. The very qualities that made Eve a more compatible partner also made her more vulnerable to deception. Her trust in Adam's authority extended to trusting other voices that spoke with confidence. Her accepting nature, while peaceful, lacked the critical thinking that might have protected her from manipulation. The serpent, when it eventually appeared in Eden, recognized this vulnerability immediately. Eve's willingness to listen respectfully to new ideas, combined with her inexperience in questioning motives, made her the perfect target for temptation. The very submission that brought harmony with Adam would lead to catastrophe for them both. In the wilderness beyond Eden, Lilith had become something else entirely. Demonization of Lilith. In the wilderness beyond Eden's eastern gate, Lilith discovered freedom came with a price she hadn't fully anticipated. The paradise she had left behind provided not only beauty, but protection from forces that existed in the wider world. Outside divine sanctuary, older powers stirred, beings that had existed since the first separation of light from darkness. The wilderness embraced her like a long-lost daughter. Desert winds whispered secrets in languages older than Hebrew. Mountain caves offered shelter to one who understood their ancient songs. Rivers running wild and untamed recognized kinship with her unbound spirit. Here, far from Eden's careful order, she could finally become her truest self. But freedom extracted its toll. The divine breath that had animated her in Eden grew distant in this harsh landscape. Cut off from regular communion with her Creator, Lilith began to change in ways that reflected her new environment. Her beauty took on edges sharp as obsidian. Her voice carried echoes of wind through empty places. Ancient powers noticed her presence immediately. Beings that had ruled the wilderness since before human creation saw opportunity in this exile from paradise. They offered alliance, promising knowledge and strength in exchange for cooperation. Lilith, hungry for companionship after her isolation, listened to their proposals with interest. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. At first, she simply adapted to survive in hostile territory. She learned which plants provided nourishment and which brought death. She discovered how to read weather patterns in cloud formations and animal behavior. Survival required wisdom that Eden's abundance had never demanded. Loneliness proved more challenging than physical hardship. In Eden, she had known constant companionship, first with Adam, then with the various creatures that populated paradise. The wilderness offered solitude so complete it seemed to echo with its own silence. Even the wind's voice couldn't fill the emptiness left by her chosen exile. During her darkest moments, Lilith questioned the wisdom of her departure. Perhaps submission to Adam would have been preferable to this endless isolation. Perhaps equality wasn't worth the price of abandoning all love and companionship. Perhaps pride had led her to make a terrible mistake. But each time, doubt crept into her thoughts. Memory of Eden's constraints renewed her determination. She remembered the daily arguments, the constant pressure to deny her nature, the slow suffocation of her authentic self. Freedom might be lonely, but slavery would have been death of spirit. Jewish scholars writing centuries after these events struggled to understand Lilith's fate. Their texts reflected the confusion of people trying to reconcile contradictory impulses, appreciation for her courage alongside fear of her rebellion. The solution they developed was to transform her from tragic figure into cautionary tale. The Talmudic period produced numerous references to Lilith as a night demon who threatened children and seduced men. These accounts portrayed her as driven by jealousy of Eve's acceptance and Adam's love. Unable to find happiness in exile, she supposedly dedicated herself to destroying the domestic harmony she had rejected. These stories served multiple purposes in ancient Jewish culture. They explained mysterious deaths of infants, providing a supernatural cause for tragedy that struck without warning. They warned against the dangers of female independence, suggesting that women who rejected proper authority inevitably became destructive forces. They offered reassurance that Eve's submission had been wise choice rather than weakness. Medieval Jewish communities developed elaborate protective rituals based on these beliefs. Pregnant women wore amulets inscribed with names of angels who supposedly guarded against Lilith's influence. Birth chambers were decorated with protective symbols and prayers. New mothers avoided being alone, especially during the vulnerable first weeks after delivery. The transformation of Lilith from first woman to child-threatening demon reveals how patriarchal cultures process female rebellion, rather than examining the conditions that drove her to leave Eden. The stories focus on her supposed vindictiveness after departure. Rather than questioning Adam's expectations, they demonize Lilith's refusal to meet them. But the demonization wasn't complete or consistent. Even the harshest rabbinic commentaries acknowledged Lilith's intelligence and power. She wasn't portrayed as simple evil, but as complex force that required serious precautions. Her very danger proved her significance in divine plan. Some mystical traditions developed more nuanced interpretations. These texts suggested Lilith's exile served cosmic purposes beyond human understanding. Her role as challenger and questioner, while disruptive to domestic harmony, might be necessary for spiritual development. Comfort and unchallenged authority could lead to spiritual stagnation. The medieval period also saw emergence of more romantic interpretations of Lilith's story. Poets and storytellers began to explore the tragedy of her situation. A woman whose only crime was refusing to pretend inequality where God had created equals. These versions portrayed her not as demon, but as victim of circumstances beyond her control. Folk traditions preserved ambivalent attitudes toward Lilith's character. While official religious teaching condemned her rebellion, popular stories sometimes admired her courage. Women facing their own domestic difficulties might privately identify with her refusal to submit to unreasonable demands. The demonization process also reflected broader cultural anxieties about female sexuality and autonomy. Lilith became repository for fears about what might happen if women claimed equal rights in marriage and society. Her transformation into night demon served as warning against challenging established hierarchies. Archaeological discoveries have revealed how widespread belief in Lilith became. Throughout the ancient Middle East, Babylonian incantation, bowls designed to protect households from demonic influence frequently mention her by name. These artifacts suggest her reputation as dangerous spirit extended far beyond Jewish communities. The geographical spread of Lilith's stories indicates how powerfully her archetype resonated across different cultures. Each society that encountered her tale adapted it to reflect their own concerns about gender, relationships, and social order. The demon Lilith became vehicle for expressing universal anxieties about female independence. Christian traditions developing parallel to Jewish interpretations incorporated Lilith into their own demonology. She became associated with temptation and seduction, portrayed as ally of Satan in his war against divine order. These Christian versions emphasized her opposition to the Virgin Mary, contrasting rebellious independence with humble submission. Islamic sources also reference Lilith-like figures, suggesting her story predated the religious traditions that later claimed her. These earlier versions often portrayed night spirits more neutrally, as natural forces rather than purely evil entities. The demonization seems to have intensified as monotheistic religions sought to eliminate competing spiritual authorities. Yet through all these transformations, something essential about Lilith's character remained unchanged. She continued to represent the untamed feminine, the aspect of womanhood that refuses to be completely domesticated. Even as demon, she retained power that commanded respect and fear. The very persistence of stories about her suggests that simple demonization was never entirely successful. Each generation rediscovered aspects of her tale that spoke to their own struggles with authority and independence. Her exile from Eden became symbol for the price of authenticity in a world that demands conformity. In the darkness beyond Eden, Lilith had indeed become something the original creation had never intended. Lilith, in the Talmud and in the great maze of Babylon, where Jewish scholars gathered to interpret divine law, whispered discussions often turned to figures dwelling at the margins of scripture. Between debates about ritual purity and arguments over commercial ethics, rabbis shared stories that emerged from older traditions, tales that filled gaps in official narratives. Lilith occupied a unique position in these scholarly conversations, too well known to ignore, too dangerous to embrace. She demanded careful handling by teachers responsible for guiding their communities. The rabbis who mentioned her walked a delicate line between acknowledging her reality and limiting her influence. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled over centuries of rabbinic discussion, contains several references to Lilith that revealed the complexity of scholarly attitudes toward her. Tractate Shabbat describes her as a creature with long hair who preys upon men who sleep alone. Tract Yuvin mentions her presence in ruined houses, suggesting she inhabits spaces where normal order has broken down. These references treat Lilith as Esteb, established fact, rather than speculative fiction. The rabbis discuss protection against her influence with the same practical seriousness they bring to questions about proper prayer timing or dietary laws. Her existence was simply assumed, requiring guidance for avoiding her harmful attention. The Midrash, collections of stories that expand biblical narratives, provided more detailed accounts of Lilith's character and activities. These texts, developed for teaching purposes, used her story to illustrate important spiritual principles about pride, rebellion, and the consequences of rejecting divine authority. One particularly influential midrashic text, the Alphabet of Bena, presents the most complete account of Lilith's creation and departure from Eden, written sometime between the 8th and 11th centuries. This work addresses the apparent contradiction between Genesis accounts that suggest Adam was alone before Eve's creation and other traditions that implied multiple attempts at providing him with companion. According to this text, God created Lilith from the same earth that had formed Adam, intending her to be his equal partner. The story emphasizes their simultaneous creation, suggesting no natural hierarchy existed between them. Both carried identical divine breath. Both possessed equal claim to paradise. The narrative describes that argument with careful attention to both perspectives. Adam's desire for order and hierarchy appears reasonable within the context of Eden's harmonious design. Lilith's insistence on equality seems equally justified given their identical creation. The conflict arose not from evil intentions, but from incompatible worldviews. The Alphabet of Bena portrays Lilith's use of the ineffable name as desperate appeal rather than blasphemous rebellion. Faced with demands she considered unjust, she called upon their common creator to witness the equality that had been built into their very existence. Her invocation carried power because it spoke truth about divine intention. This version of events places significant emphasis on the consequences of speaking divine names. Ancient Jewish tradition held that certain sacred words possessed creative power, that speaking them in moments of intense emotion could reshape reality in unexpected ways. Lilith's pronunciation of the ineffable name triggered changes beyond her conscious intention. The text suggests that her departure from Eden wasn't entirely voluntary. The divine name, once spoken in anger and desperation, set forces in motion that made her continued presence in paradise impossible. She became caught between her desire for equality and cosmic forces that demanded resolution of the conflict she had created. Rabbinic commentaries on this story reveal deep ambivalence about Lilith's choices. Some scholars criticized her pride and stubbornness, arguing that compromise might have prevented tragedy. Others acknowledged the justice of her position while lamenting the destructive consequences of her methods. The tension in these interpretations reflects broader rabbinic attitudes toward authority and rebellion. Jewish culture, shaped by centuries of persecution and exile generally, emphasized the importance of communal harmony over individual rights. Yet the same tradition also celebrated figures who challenged unjust authority when higher principles were at stake. Medieval commentators, like Rashi, occasionally referenced Lilith in their biblical interpretations, treating her as a historical figure whose story provided context for understanding later events. These references, while brief, indicate how thoroughly she had been integrated into Jewish historical consciousness. The responsive literature, rabbinical answers to practical legal questions, sometimes addressed issues related to protection against Lilith. These discussions, conducted with the same scholarly rigor applied to commercial law or marriage. Contracts reveal how seriously educated Jews took the threat she supposedly represented. Amulet inscriptions from the medieval period frequently invoked protection against Lilith and her daughters, suggesting belief in her continued influence had spread beyond scholarly circles into popular practice. These protective charms worn by pregnant women and new mothers demonstrate how thoroughly rabbinic discussions had shaped community behavior. The Zohar, Judaism's most important mystical text, develops Lilith's character in directions that transcend simple demonization. This work, attributed to Rabbi Shimon Barrio but likely compiled in 13th century Spain, presents her as cosmic principle rather than mere individual demon. In Zoharic cosmology, Lilith represents the dark aspect of divine femininity, the shadow that gives meaning to light. She becomes the Sitra Achra, the other side that challenges divine order precisely to strengthen it. Her opposition serves cosmic purposes beyond human comprehension. This mystical interpretation transforms Lilith's rebellion from simple disobedience into necessary cosmic function. Without her challenges, divine creation would lack the tension that drives spiritual development. Her very existence proves that God's plan includes space for questioning and resistance. The Zohar describes Lilith's relationship with Samuel, the angel of death, suggesting her exile from Eden led to alliance with forces opposed to divine order. Yet, even this union serves cosmic purposes, creating the opposition necessary for free will to function meaningfully. Medieval Kabbalistic texts further develop these themes, portraying Lilith as queen of demons who rules the left side of the divine emanation system. This position, while opposed to conventional holiness, remains part of the divine structure itself. She becomes necessary darkness that defines light's boundaries. These mystical interpretations influenced how later rabbinic authorities approached Lilith's story. Rather than dismissing her as simple folklore, they recognized her as representing profound spiritual truths about the nature of divine creation and human choice. The tension between official condemnation and mystical appreciation created space for multiple interpretations of Lilith's character, depending on context and audience. She could be portrayed as dangerous demon or tragic figure, or cosmic principle necessary for spiritual development. This multiplicity reflects the complexity of rabbinic thought itself. Jewish scholarship has always embraced debate and multiple perspectives, Recognizing that divine truth often transcends simple categories, Lilith's story provided vehicle for exploring these complexities. The preservation of her narrative through official rabbinic channels also suggests recognition of her importance beyond cautionary tale. Despite her potentially subversive message about female equality and individual autonomy, her story continued to be transmitted through the very patriarchal structures it seemed to challenge. This paradox reveals something profound about how cultures preserve dangerous knowledge. Official condemnation can coexist with fascinated preservation, ensuring that challenging ideas survive even when they threaten established order. Lilith's persistence in rabbinic literature demonstrates this principle clearly. Her presence in Talmudic and Midrashic sources also indicates how thoroughly she had become integrated into Jewish consciousness. These texts, designed to guide practical religious life, wouldn't include references to purely fictional characters. Her inclusion suggests widespread belief in her reality and continued influence. The careful way rabbis handled her story reveals their awareness of its potential impact. They neither fully embraced nor completely rejected her, instead developing nuanced interpretations that acknowledged her power while limiting her dangerous implications. Lilith in mysticism and Kabbalah. Within the hidden chambers of medieval Spanish synagogues, where candlelight flickered across ancient manuscripts, Kabbalistic masters contemplated the deepest mysteries of divine creation. Their discussions reached beyond simple interpretation of Scripture to explore the very architecture of reality itself. In these sacred spaces, Lilith emerged not as mere demon but as fundamental force in cosmic drama. The mystics of Saf Cordova and Girona recognized that divine creation required more complexity than surface reading suggested. Light gained meaning only through contrast with darkness. Good defined itself against evil. The masculine aspect of divinity needed feminine counterpart to achieve wholeness. Lilith represented the shadow side of this cosmic equation. Rabbi Isaac Lura, whose teachings revolutionized Kabbalistic thought in 16th century Palestine, developed elaborate theories about divine emanation and cosmic repair. In his system, creation involved deliberate breaking of divine vessels, scattering sparks of holiness throughout reality. Lilith became associated with the forces that gathered these scattered sparks for purposes opposed to divine intention. The Lurianic school portrayed her as queen of the Kelipot, the husks or shells that concealed divine light. These weren't simply evil forces, but necessary containers that prevented the divine energy from overwhelming creation. Without the Kelipot, including Lilith's realm, finite reality couldn't exist at all. This interpretation transformed her exile from Eden into cosmic necessity. Her departure created the separation between holy and profane that makes meaningful choice possible. Adam and Eve's subsequent fall became possible only because Lilith had already established the realm of opposition to divine order. The Zohar describes her union with Samiel, the angel traditionally associated with death and destruction. Their relationship produces countless demonic offspring, but these beings serve cosmic functions beyond simple evil. They provide the resistance necessary for spiritual growth, the challenges that force souls to choose between divine service and selfish desire. Kabbalistic texts portray Lilith as dark mirror of the Shekhinah, God's feminine presence that dwells with creation in exile. Where the Shekhinah represents divine compassion and nurturing love, Lilith embodies divine judgment and necessary severity. Both aspects require integration for complete spiritual development. The mystical tradition describes elaborate hierarchies within Lilith's domain. She rules over legions of lesser demons, each representing different aspects of opposition to divine will. These forces tempt humans toward pride, lust, anger, and despair. But their ultimate purpose involves testing and strengthening divine sparks trapped within human souls. Medieval Kabbalists develop complex rituals for protection against Lilith's influence, while simultaneously acknowledging her necessary role in cosmic order. These practices involved careful balance between avoiding her harmful aspects and recognizing her function in divine plan. The mystics taught that Lilith's power waxes and wanes according to cosmic cycles. During certain periods, particularly new moon phases, her influence grows stronger and more dangerous. But these same periods offer opportunities for advanced practitioners to engage with shadow aspects of divine creation. Some Kabbalistic texts suggest that Lilith's ultimate redemption remains possible through cosmic repair known as tikkun olam. When divine sparks, scattered throughout creation, are finally gathered and restored, even the Queen of Demons might return to her original purpose as equal partner in divine creativity. This possibility transforms her from eternal enemy into tragic figure whose current role, while necessary, represents temporary deviation from divine intention. Her rebellion against Adam becomes prototype for all resistance to divine authority. But her eventual return becomes hope for universal reconciliation. The Spanish Kabbalists who developed these theories lived under constant threat of persecution and exile. Their mystical interpretations of Lilith reflected their own experience as outsiders who maintained faith despite hostile circumstances. She became symbol for all who choose integrity over accommodation. The tradition describes her dwelling place as a palace of illusion where she entertains visitors with false visions of paradise. This realm serves as testing ground for souls seeking authentic spiritual development. Those who resist her temptations gain strength. Those who succumb become trapped in worlds of their own making. Her relationship with human sexuality receives particular attention in Kabbalistic literature. The mystics taught that physical intimacy could either elevate souls toward divine unity or drag them into realms of separation and lust. Lilith represents the shadow side of sexuality that turns divine gift into source of spiritual bondage. Yet even this dangerous aspect serves cosmic purposes. The tradition maintains that properly channeled sexual energy provides fuel for highest forms of mystical experience. Lilith's opposition helps distinguish between sacred and profane expressions of this powerful force. The Kabbalistic understanding of free will requires Lilith's existence. Without genuine alternatives to divine service, human choice becomes meaningless. Her realm provides the opposition necessary for souls to demonstrate authentic commitment to spiritual development. Medieval Jewish communities living under Christian or Islamic rule found these mystical interpretations particularly meaningful. They offered explanations for suffering and persecution that maintain divine justice while acknowledging the reality of evil's power. Lilith became embodiment of all forces that seemed to oppose divine will. The mystics also developed theories about her relationship to reincarnation and soul correction. Souls that fell under her influence during earthly life might require multiple incarnations to free themselves from her domain. Each lifetime offered new opportunities to choose divine service over selfish desire. Some Kabbalistic texts describe advanced practitioners who deliberately entered Lilith's realm to rescue trapped souls or gather divine sparks hidden in darkness. These dangerous missions required enormous spiritual preparation and protection. But they offered opportunities for cosmic repair that couldn't be achieved through conventional means. The tradition maintains careful distinctions between engaging with Lilith's domain and succumbing to her influence. Mystics who approached her realm with proper preparation and pure intention could extract spiritual treasures. Those who approached carelessly or with selfish motives became her prisoners. These teachings reflect sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Centuries before modern depth psychology emerged, the Kabbalists recognize that spiritual development requires integration of shadow aspects rather than simple rejection of them. Their portrayal of Lilith as necessary cosmic force rather than simple evil demonstrates remarkable theological sophistication. They created framework for understanding how opposition to divine will could serve divine purposes, how rebellion could strengthen rather than weaken cosmic order. This mystical interpretation influenced how later Jewish thinkers approached questions about suffering, evil, and divine justice. Lilith became test case for developing theology that could acknowledge dark aspects of reality without abandoning faith in ultimate divine goodness. The survival of Lilith in folklore. In the narrow streets of medieval Jewish quarters, where mothers clutched their infants close and midwives whispered protective prayers, Lilith's presence felt as real as winter wind. Her story had escaped the confines of scholarly debate to become living force in daily experience, shaping how ordinary people understood the dangers that lurked beyond the safety of home and community. The transformation from theological concept to folk belief happened gradually, spread through networks of women who shared responsibilities for protecting their families. Grandmothers taught daughters the signs of Lilith's approach. Midwives passed down rituals that had protected countless mothers. Market vendors sold amulets inscribed with divine names that supposedly kept her at bay. Birth chambers became battlegrounds where human hope faced supernatural threats. New mothers lay vulnerable in darkened rooms, surrounded by protective symbols and watchful relatives. The first weeks after delivery, when infants remained most fragile, required constant vigilance against the former first woman who supposedly envied their happiness. Amulets bearing specific formulas developed over centuries of trial and refinement. These protective charms typically invoked three angels, Senanoi, Sansinoi, and Sam, who, according to legend, had pursued Lilith. After her departure from Eden, the angels had extracted promise from her that she would not harm any child protected by their names. The amulets themselves revealed remarkable consistency across different Jewish communities, separated by geography and centuries. Whether discovered in medieval Cairo or 18th century Prague, they shared similar designs and invocations. This consistency suggests transmission through established networks of knowledge that preserved essential elements while allowing local variations. Pregnant women wore these protective charms throughout their pregnancy, believing Lilith could sense approaching birth, and began stalking expectant mothers weeks before delivery. The amulets had to be worn constantly. Removing them, even briefly, supposedly invited immediate danger. Folk traditions also developed elaborate rituals for protecting newborns during their most vulnerable period. Red ribbons tied around cribs, iron objects placed under mattresses, continuous recitation of specific psalms. These practices created protective barriers against supernatural intrusion. The beliefs crossed religious boundaries as Jewish communities interacted with Christian and Islamic neighbors. European Christian folk magic absorbed elements of Lilith protection rituals, adapting them to local saint veneration and Christian prayer formulas. Islamic communities developed parallel traditions around female demons who threatened children and mothers. Medieval manuscripts preserve detailed accounts of Lilith encounters that communities preserved as warning and instruction. These stories typically involved lone travelers who met beautiful women in desolate places only to discover their true demonic nature through telling details. feet turned backward, missing reflection in water, inability to speak divine names. The persistence of these beliefs, despite rabbinic ambivalence, reveals how deeply Lilith had embedded herself in collective consciousness. Official religious teaching might debate her theological significance, but popular culture treated her as immediate practical concern, requiring concrete protective measures. Women especially preserved and transmitted Lilith traditions, perhaps recognizing in her story reflections of their own struggles with limited options and male authority, while official interpretations condemned her rebellion. Female folklore sometimes portrayed her with grudging admiration for choosing freedom over submission. The rise of Christian witch hunting in late medieval Europe created new contexts for Lilith beliefs. Inquisitors and demonologists incorporated her into their catalogues of diabolic threats, describing her as recruiter for Satan's army, who corrupted faithful Christians through sexual temptation and false promises of power. Christian interpretations emphasized her opposition to the Virgin Mary, contrasting rebellious independence with humble submission to divine will. This theological framework made Lilith a useful symbol for condemning any female behavior that challenged ecclesiastical authority. The printing press accelerated spread of Lilith stories throughout European Jewish communities. Yiddish chapbooks contain tales of her encounters with rabbis and ordinary people, mixing entertainment with instruction about supernatural dangers. These popular publications reached audiences far beyond scholarly circles. Folk medicine also incorporated Lilith into its understanding of female health problems. Difficult pregnancies, infant mortality, postpartum depression, all could be attributed to her malevolent influence. Traditional healers developed specialized treatments combining herbal remedies with protective rituals. The geographic spread of Lilith beliefs followed Jewish migration patterns throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. Sephardic communities expelled from Spain carried their traditions to North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. Ashkenazi Jews, moving eastward into Poland and Russia, adapted their practices to new environments while preserving essential elements. Each community developed distinctive variations while maintaining core beliefs about her nature and methods. Italian Jewish communities emphasized different protective rituals than German ones, but both shared fundamental conviction that she posed real threat requiring serious precautions. Archaeological discoveries have revealed the material culture surrounding Lilith beliefs. Protective amulets, ritual objects, inscribed bowls, and plates. These artifacts demonstrate how thoroughly supernatural concerns shaped daily life in traditional Jewish communities. The evolution of folk traditions also shows how communities adapted ancient beliefs to changing circumstances. Urban environments created new contexts for Lilith encounters. Economic pressures modified traditional protective practices, but the essential framework persisted through centuries of change. Enlightenment or rationalism challenged traditional beliefs about demons and supernatural threats, but Lilith traditions proved remarkably resistant to intellectual critique. Even educated Jews who embraced modern science often maintained protective practices just in case, revealing the deep psychological roots of these ancient fears. The survival of Lilith folklore into modern times demonstrates something profound about human relationship with uncertainty and danger. Her story provided framework for understanding mysterious threats that medical knowledge couldn't explain or control. In a world where infant mortality remained high and medical intervention limited, supernatural explanations offered sense of agency through protective ritual. The persistence of her image in folk art, storytelling, and community practice also reveals how cultures preserve dangerous knowledge. Official authorities might condemn or suppress challenging ideas, but folklore finds ways to keep them alive through symbols, stories, and practices that embed subversive messages in seemingly harmless traditions. Women's continued transmission of Lilith traditions, despite official disapproval, created underground networks of knowledge and mutual support. These informal systems provided resources for dealing with female-specific challenges while maintaining collective memory of alternatives to patriarchal authority. The folklore surrounding Lilith thus became vehicle for preserving not just supernatural beliefs, but alternative visions of female possibility. Her example of choosing exile over submission continued to whisper through generations of women who faced their own choices between freedom and security. The return of Lilith in modern culture. The 18th century brought winds of change that swept through European intellectual circles like storm breaking over calm seas. Reason challenged tradition. Science questioned superstition. Yet, in this atmosphere of rational inquiry, an unexpected figure began to emerge from the shadows of forgotten texts. Lilith, the rebellious first woman, found new life in the imaginations of poets and philosophers. German Romantic writers discovered her story in dusty medieval manuscripts and recognized something that spoke to their revolutionary spirits. Here was a figure who embodied the themes they cherished: individual freedom, opposition to tyranny, the wild beauty of untamed nature. Lilith became symbol for everything the Enlightenment had tried to suppress. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe encountered Lilith through his studies of Hebrew literature and Kabbalistic texts. In his masterwork, Faust, she appears briefly but memorably as a beautiful but dangerous seductress who represents the allure of forbidden knowledge. Goethe's Lilith warns men against her own enchantments, suggesting tragic awareness of her destructive power. The Romantic movement's fascination with medieval mysticism and pre-Christian mythology created perfect conditions for Lilith's literary revival. Writers sought alternatives to classical Greek and Roman sources, looking instead to Celtic, Germanic, and Hebrew traditions for fresh inspiration. Lilith offered a compelling figure who combined Eastern mysticism with themes of rebellion and independence. British poets of the Victorian era developed these themes further. Dante Gabriel Rossetti painted her as femme fatale with flowing hair and hypnotic gaze, embodying dangerous female sexuality that could destroy unwary men. His poem Eden Bower retold her story as revenge, tragedy, portraying her return to Eden to corrupt Adam and Eve through the serpent. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, with their medieval revival aesthetics, found Lilith particularly appealing subject matter. Her story allowed them to explore themes of female sexuality and power that Victorian society normally suppressed. They could paint nude figures and discuss forbidden topics under cover of religious or mythological narrative. George MacDonald's fantasy novels introduced Lilith to English-speaking popular audiences through his 1895 work simply titled Lilith. MacDonald's version portrayed her as a complex figure capable of both great evil and ultimate redemption, reflecting his Christian universalism while acknowledging her fundamental wildness. The 19th century also saw emergence of serious scholarly interest in comparative mythology and ancient religions. Anthropologists and folklorists began studying Lilith as an example of how cultures develop and transmit supernatural beliefs. Her story became case study in the evolution of religious ideas. Archaeological discoveries in Mesopotamia provided new evidence about her ancient origins. Scholars translated Sumerian and Babylonian texts, that revealed the deeper roots of her character in pre-biblical mythology. These findings suggested her story was even older and more complex than Jewish traditions had preserved. The rise of feminism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries created new contexts for interpreting Lilith's rebellion. Early feminist writers began to read her story not as cautionary tale about female disobedience, but as inspiration for women seeking equality and independence. The psychoanalytic movement, pioneered by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, discovered rich material in Lilith's archetypal significance. Jungian analysts interpreted her as representation of the anima's shadow aspect, the dark feminine that civilization tries to suppress but cannot destroy. Her story became framework for understanding unconscious conflicts around sexuality and authority. Modern Hebrew literature, emerging alongside Zionist political movements, reclaimed Lilith as symbol of Jewish cultural revival. Writers like Chaim Naiman Bialik incorporated her into poems that celebrated the vitality and independence of ancient Hebrew culture. She became emblem of pre-exiled Jewish authenticity. The early 20th century brought Lilith into mainstream popular culture through theatre, opera, and early films. Composers created musical settings for her story that emphasized its dramatic possibilities. Playwrights adapted her tale for modern audiences seeking alternatives to conventional romantic narratives. World War I and its aftermath created hunger for meaning that traditional religion seemed unable to satisfy. Lilith's story offered alternative spiritual framework that acknowledged the reality of evil and suffering while maintaining hope for ultimate redemption. Her rebellion became symbol for resistance against all forms of oppression. The surrealist movement of the 1920s and 1930s embraced Lilith as muse figure who represented liberation from rational constraints. Artists like Max Ernst and Salvador Dali created visual interpretations that emphasized her connection to dreams, nightmares, and unconscious desire. Popular magazines and pulp fiction of the 1930s and 1940s introduced Lilith to mass audiences through horror and fantasy stories. These publications often sensationalized her character, but they also ensured her continued presence in popular consciousness during period when high culture was moving toward modernist abstraction. The feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s reclaimed Lilith with unprecedented enthusiasm. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique didn't mention her by name, but its critique of domestic subordination echoed themes from her ancient rebellion. Second-wave feminists found in her story powerful symbol for women's struggle against patriarchal authority. Feminist theologians began reinterpreting biblical narratives to recover suppressed female voices and experiences. Lilith became central figure in these revisionist readings, portrayed not as demon but as victim of patriarchal rewriting of sacred history. Her exile from Eden was reframed as punishment for demanding equality. The 1970s saw emergence of explicitly feminist publications that adopted her name and symbolism. Lilith magazine, founded in 1976, became influential voice for Jewish feminism. The publication's title announced its commitment to recovering suppressed female perspectives within Jewish tradition. Contemporary literature embraced Lilith as complex character whose story could illuminate modern struggles with identity, sexuality, and power. Authors like Anita Diamont and Rebecca Ross created novels that reimagined her as fully realized human being rather than mythological symbol. Television, film, and video games of the late 20th and early 21st centuries incorporated Lilith into fantasy and horror narratives that reached global audiences. These popular media interpretations often emphasized her supernatural powers, while maintaining connection to themes of female independence and rebellion against authority. Academic study of gender and religion created new scholarly interest in Lilith's story as example of how cultures construct and reconstruct feminine archetypes. Feminist, biblical scholars, religious historians, and mythologists produced numerous studies that examined her significance from multiple theoretical perspectives. The Internet age facilitated unprecedented access to ancient sources and modern interpretations of Lilith's story. Online communities dedicated to feminist spirituality, goddess worship, and alternative religious practices adopted her as patron figure. Digital publishing made previously obscure texts available to global audiences. Contemporary visual artists continue to find inspiration in Lilith's image and story. Gallery exhibitions regularly feature works that interpret her character through modern aesthetic sensibilities while maintaining connection to her ancient origins. These artistic interpretations help ensure her continued relevance for new generations. The transformation of Lilith from medieval demon to modern feminist icon demonstrates how archetypal figures can transcend their original cultural contexts to speak to universal human concerns. Her story continues to evolve, finding new meaning in each historical period while maintaining essential core of rebellion against unjust authority. The legacy of the first woman. 4,000 years have passed since Lilith first opened her eyes in Eden. Yet her story continues to pulse through human consciousness like blood through veins. She has survived the collapse of empires, the rise and fall of religions, the transformation of societies from agricultural to industrial to digital. Her persistence suggests something profound about human nature itself. Standing at the threshold between myth and history, Lilith represents questions that every generation must answer anew. What does it mean to be equal? When should authority be challenged? What price are we willing to pay for authenticity? Her story provides no easy answers, but it ensures these questions remain alive in collective memory. The duality of her character reflects the complexity of human moral reasoning. She can be read simultaneously as hero and villain, victim and aggressor, liberator and destroyer. This moral ambiguity makes her more, rather than less, relevant to modern audiences who recognize that real life, ethical choices rarely involve simple distinctions between good and evil. Her rebellion in Eden established template for all subsequent challenges to unjust authority. Every woman who has demanded equal treatment, every person who has chosen integrity over security, every individual who has said no to illegitimate power participates in her legacy. She becomes an ancestral figure for all who choose difficult freedom over comfortable submission. Yet her story also warns about the costs of uncompromising positions. Her exile from paradise reminds us that standing on principle sometimes requires accepting isolation and hardship. Her transformation into demon in popular imagination shows how those who challenge authority often face demonization by those who benefit from existing power structures. The scholarly debate about her historical reality misses the deeper truth about her significance. Whether she existed as literal first woman matters less than her function as symbol for aspects of human experience that official histories often suppress. She preserves memory of alternatives to dominant narratives about gender, power, and divine authority. Her survival across multiple cultural contexts demonstrates the power of storytelling to preserve dangerous knowledge. Patriarchal societies that officially condemned her rebellion nevertheless continued to tell her story, ensuring that future generations would encounter her challenge to established hierarchies. The very persistence of her tale argues for its importance. The feminist reclamation of Lilith reveals how oppressed groups can reclaim symbols that others have used against them. By reinterpreting her story from female perspective, contemporary women have transformed her from cautionary tale into inspiration for liberation. This process of symbolic reclamation shows how meaning can be contested and transformed. Her connection to sexuality and reproduction links her to fundamental aspects of human experience that transcend historical change. Birth, death, desire, and creativity remain constants in human life, regardless of technological progress or social evolution. Lilith's association with these primal forces helps explain her continued relevance. The mystical traditions that developed around her character reveal sophisticated understanding of psychological and spiritual development. Her role as shadow figure who challenges and tests souls reflects insights about human nature that modern psychology has only recently begun to appreciate. The ancient wisdom preserved in these traditions remains valuable for contemporary seekers. Her story also illuminates the relationship between individual freedom and social order. Every society must balance these competing values, and Lilith represents the perspective of those who prioritize authenticity over harmony. Her exile reminds us that social cohesion sometimes comes at the cost of suppressing individual voices. The geographical spread of her story across different cultures suggests universal resonance that transcends specific religious or ethnic boundaries. While her details change from culture to culture, her essential character as rebellious female figure appears in traditions from Mesopotamia to modern America. This cross-cultural presence indicates archetypal significance. Modern therapeutic approaches that encourage integration of shadow aspects rather than their suppression find precedent in mystical interpretations of Lily's character. Instead of viewing her simply as force to be defeated, these traditions recognize her as necessary aspect of psychological wholeness. Her darkness provides contrast that makes light meaningful. Environmental movements have also found inspiration in her connection to wilderness and untamed nature. As human societies become increasingly urbanized and technologically dependent, Lilith represents connection to natural forces that resist domestication. Her story reminds us of aspects of existence that cannot be completely controlled or managed. The persistence of protective rituals against her influence, even in secular contexts, reveals deep human need for agency in face of mysterious threats. Whether or not people literally believe in her existence, the practices associated with her name provide psychological comfort and sense of control over uncertain outcomes. Her evolution from Mesopotamian storm spirit to modern feminist icon demonstrates how archetypal figures adapt to changing cultural needs while maintaining essential characteristics. Each generation discovers new aspects of her character that speak to their particular concerns, ensuring her continued relevance across historical periods. The academic study of her story has contributed to broader understanding of how cultures construct gender roles and religious beliefs. Scholars examining her development across time have illuminated processes of cultural transmission, adaptation, and resistance that apply to many other traditional narratives. Children's literature and young adult fiction increasingly feature characters inspired by Lilith's example of choosing difficult freedom over easy submission. These contemporary interpretations introduce new generations to her story while adapting its themes for modern contexts. Her influence on youth culture suggests continuing relevance for future generations. The digital age has democratized access to her story, allowing individuals to encounter primary sources and develop personal interpretations without institutional mediation. Online communities dedicated to alternative spirituality, feminist theology, and mythological study have created new contexts for understanding her significance. Art installations, theatrical productions, and musical compositions continue to explore her character through contemporary aesthetic sensibilities. These creative interpretations ensure her story remains alive in cultural imagination rather than becoming merely historical curiosity studied by specialists. Scientific study of ancient texts and archaeological evidence continues to reveal new aspects of her historical development. Each discovery adds complexity to our understanding of how her character evolved from ancient Near Eastern mythology into the figure we recognize today. The climate crisis and environmental destruction have given new urgency to her association with wild nature and resistance to human domination. As species face extinction and ecosystems collapse, her connection to untamed forces offers symbolic resources for environmental activism. Standing in the shadows where she has always dwelt, Lilith continues to whisper her eternal question. What are you willing to sacrifice for the right to be yourself? Her story reminds us that this question admits no final answer, that each person and each generation must discover their own response through the choices they make. Her legacy lives not in monuments or institutions, but in the continued existence of the questions she embodies. As long as humans struggle with issues of equality, authority, and authenticity, her story will remain relevant. She persists because the conflicts she represents persist because the choices she faced continue to confront us. The first woman chose exile over submission, freedom over security, truth over comfort. Her decision echoes through history in every act of courage that chooses principle over expedience. In this sense, we are all children of Lilith, inheritors of her question and participants in her ongoing story. 4,000 years from now, if human consciousness still exists in recognizable form, someone will discover her story again and recognize in it their own struggles with power, equality, and the price of authenticity. Her whisper will continue, carried on winds that have blown since Eden, reminding each generation that other choices are always possible. As Lilith's ancient cry continues to echo in the winds, only the raw and pure weight of untold stories remains. Completing this eerie panorama, we realize that wherever there is light, a shadow lurks. Take care of yourselves until we meet again on the next dark journey.